There are things that happen to almost every one of us as we grow older, small shifts in behavior that families notice, sometimes with frustration, sometimes with quiet worry, and almost always without understanding why they are happening at all. Adult children whisper about them to each other in kitchens after visits home. Spouses learn to work around them without ever quite naming them out loud. And the older adults themselves are often the last to realize these changes are even happening, let alone why. Today, I want to name 12 of these behaviors honestly, without judgment, because I believe understanding them changes everything about how we respond to them, both in the people we love and in ourselves as the years continue to pass. The first thing is repetition, telling the same story, sometimes word for word, to the same person, more times than either of you can count. Families often find this maddening, especially adult children who have heard a particular story about their grandfather's childhood farm or their grandmother's first job, dozens of times across dozens of visits. But I want you to understand what is actually happening here, because it is rarely simple forgetfulness alone. As we age, certain memories, particularly the ones tied to strong emotion or personal identity, become worn into deep, well-used pathways in the brain, pathways that remain vivid and easily accessible even as newer, more recent memories become harder to form and retain. A story told repeatedly is often a story that matters enormously to the person telling it, a piece of their identity they are, in some sense, working to preserve and pass along before it is too late. The next time you hear a familiar story, begin again. I encourage you to resist the urge to interrupt with, "You already told me this." Listen instead as though for the first time, because for that person, in that moment, telling it may matter more than you realize. I think of a man named Walter, a retired railroad worker who told the same story about a snowstorm in 1961 at nearly every family dinner for the better part of a decade. His grandchildren would exchange knowing glances the moment he cleared his throat and began, mouthing the punchline along with him under their breath. It was only after he passed that his eldest granddaughter admitted, through tears, that she wished desperately she had recorded him telling it just once, properly, all the way through, rather than rolling her eyes through half of it every single time. That story, she realized far too late, was not simply an old man repeating himself. It was the one memory he had chosen, again and again, to keep alive in the room. The second thing is holding on to belongings far beyond what seems reasonable. Closets stuffed with decades-old clothing, garages filled with tools no longer used, drawers packed with papers, receipts, and trinkets that appear, to everyone else, to have no remaining purpose. Families often label this as hoarding, sometimes with real alarm, and occasionally that label is genuinely accurate and worth addressing with professional support. But far more often, what looks like clutter to a younger generation represents something entirely different to the person holding on to it, a tangible connection to decades of a life that otherwise feels increasingly out of their control. Letting go of a husband's old fishing gear or a child's outgrown school projects saved in a box in the attic can feel less like simple tidying and more like erasing evidence that an entire life, full and meaningful, actually happened. Approach these conversations slowly, with genuine curiosity about what specific items mean, rather than treating the entire collection as an obstacle to be cleared away as efficiently as possible. The third thing is a fierce, sometimes exhausting insistence on doing everything alone, refusing help carrying groceries, refusing a ride to appointments, refusing a simple offer to help with a task that has clearly become physically difficult. This stubbornness frustrates families enormously, especially when safety is genuinely at stake. But underneath this insistence is almost always fear, not simple pride for its own sake. Accepting help can feel, to someone who spent decades being the one who provided for others, like the first undeniable proof that decline has truly begun, that the person they have always been is slipping away. When you encounter this stubbornness in someone you love, try offering help framed as partnership rather than rescue. Instead of, "Let me do that for you," try, "Would you mind if I helped you with this part, since I could use the company anyway?" The words matter more than most people realize. A friend once described her mother refusing every offer of help carrying laundry up from the basement for months, insisting she managed perfectly fine on her own, right up until the day she genuinely fell on those stairs and broke her wrist. What changed things, eventually, was not another direct offer of help, but her daughter simply beginning to carry a basket of her own laundry down at the same time each week, turning the task into shared company rather than assistance offered to someone perceived as needing rescue. Within a few weeks, her mother stopped resisting entirely because the framing had shifted from being helped to simply being together. The fourth thing is a tendency toward complaint and criticism that can feel at times like an entirely new personality has taken over someone who was once easygoing and mild. Small annoyances, a grandchild's messy room, a slightly delayed phone call, an unfamiliar dish at dinner can provoke a reaction that seems disproportionate to whatever actually happened. Part of this stems from something surprisingly physical: chronic pain, fatigue, and the simple exhaustion of managing a body that no longer cooperates the way it once did, all lower a person's tolerance for minor frustrations considerably. Part of it also stems from something more emotional, a quiet grief over lost independence and lost control that sometimes emerges sideways, as irritability, rather than being named directly as the sadness it actually is. Recognizing complaint as a symptom, rather than simply a character flaw, can help families respond with patience rather than matching frustration with frustration of their own. The fifth thing is growing suspicious, sometimes of family members' intentions, sometimes of neighbors, occasionally of entirely reasonable requests or suggestions that get reinterpreted as some kind of scheme. This can be one of the more painful shifts for families to witness, particularly when a parent who was once warm and trusting begins questioning motives that were never anything but loving. Some of this suspicion has real cognitive roots, changes in the brain that affect judgment and interpretation of other people's behavior, but some of it also reflects a rational, if uncomfortable, awareness that older adults genuinely are targeted more often by scams and exploitation, which can create a general wariness that sometimes spreads unfairly onto family members who have never given any real reason for distrust. Patience, consistency, and gently, repeatedly demonstrating trustworthy behavior over time tend to matter more here than any single conversation ever could. The sixth thing is resistance to new technology, refusing to learn a smartphone, a tablet, a streaming service, insisting instead on the rotary phone mentality of decades past, even when the resistance clearly makes daily life more difficult than it needs to be. Families often interpret this as simple stubbornness or an unwillingness to try, but learning something entirely new asks the brain to do something it becomes measurably harder to do as we age, building unfamiliar pathways from scratch rather than relying on the deep, well-worn grooves built over a lifetime. What looks like refusal is sometimes genuine difficulty, compounded by embarrassment at needing more time and repetition than a grandchild might need to learn the very same thing. Teaching technology to an older adult benefits enormously from patience, from breaking instructions into small, written steps they can return to independently, and from resisting any hint of exasperation, which shuts down learning far more effectively than any technical difficulty ever could. I remember watching a granddaughter try to teach her grandfather to video call for the first time, growing visibly frustrated after the third attempt failed, sighing loudly enough that he quietly set the tablet down and said, "Never mind, this is not for me." It was only when she returned a week later, wrote out each step on an index card in large, simple print, and stayed calm through every single failed attempt without a hint of exasperation, that he finally succeeded, and then proudly called every one of his siblings that same afternoon to show off his new skill. The technology had not changed between those two visits. Her patience had. The seventh thing is an increasingly rigid attachment to routine and schedule, insisting on the same mealtime, the same seat at the table, the same television program at the same hour every single day, becoming genuinely distressed when these small rituals are disrupted. This can look, from the outside, like inflexibility for its own sake. But routine provides something deeply stabilizing to an aging mind and body navigating a world that otherwise feels increasingly unpredictable. When memory becomes less reliable and physical capability becomes less certain, a fixed, familiar schedule offers a kind of quiet reassurance, a structure that requires no additional cognitive effort to navigate. Rather than viewing this rigidity as something to overcome, families often find far more peace simply working gently within it, preserving the routines that matter most while introducing change slowly and with plenty of advance notice whenever it genuinely cannot be avoided. The eighth thing is a gradual decline in attention to personal hygiene and appearance. Someone who once dressed carefully every single day, now wearing the same clothing repeatedly, or resisting baths and grooming that once happened without question. I have spoken about this specific topic in more depth in another conversation here, but I want to mention it again briefly, because it deserves real attention rather than simple embarrassment or avoidance. This shift is rarely about laziness. It often reflects physical difficulty, arthritis making buttons and zippers newly painful, balance concerns making a shower feel genuinely frightening rather than simply unappealing. It can also reflect depression, isolation, or early cognitive changes that make the many small steps of grooming feel overwhelming rather than routine. Approaching this with practical problem solving, adaptive clothing, bathroom safety equipment, gentle assistance rather than simple criticism tends to help far more than pointing out the change itself ever does. The ninth thing is a quiet, gradual withdrawal from social activities and relationships that once felt essential, declining invitations, letting phone calls go unanswered, showing less interest in gatherings that used to bring genuine joy. Families sometimes interpret this as simple fatigue, or assume it reflects a general slowing down that comes naturally with age. But this particular withdrawal deserves closer attention than it usually receives, because it can signal depression, grief that has never been fully processed, or the beginning of cognitive changes that make social interaction feel more exhausting and confusing than it once did. Gently, persistently. Continuing to include someone, even after repeated declines, rather than assuming their absence reflects genuine preference, often matters more than families realize. The 10th thing is talking more frequently, sometimes almost constantly, about health concerns, medications, symptoms, and the various ailments that seem to accumulate with each passing year. Younger family members often find this exhausting, sometimes even avoiding conversations entirely to escape yet another detailed account of a doctor's appointment or a new ache that has appeared. But consider, for a moment, what daily life actually looks like from inside an aging body. Pain, fatigue, and physical limitation genuinely occupy an enormous amount of daily attention and energy in a way that younger, healthier bodies simply do not require. This is not attention-seeking for its own sake. It is, quite often, simply an honest report of what someone's day actually contained. Making a little room for these conversations, while also gently redirecting toward other topics when it becomes truly overwhelming, tends to work better than avoiding the subject altogether. The 11th thing is becoming unusually careful, sometimes to the point of real anxiety, about money, refusing to spend on things that seem entirely reasonable, worrying aloud about finances even when the numbers themselves suggest there is little genuine cause for concern. This can frustrate families considerably, particularly when a parent refuses a helpful purchase or service purely out of financial worry that does not match their actual circumstances. But this anxiety often traces back to a very real, very rational fear. The fear of outliving one's savings, of becoming a financial burden on children who have their own families and obligations to manage. For a generation raised through economic hardship, many younger family members never personally experienced. This fear runs deeper than simple habit. Addressing it directly and honestly, reviewing finances together, reassuring genuinely where reassurance is warranted, tends to ease this anxiety far more effectively than simply insisting the worry is unfounded. I knew a woman, comfortably secure financially by any reasonable measure, who nonetheless reused tea bags twice and turned off every light in a room the moment she left it, habits her children found simultaneously endearing and exasperating. It was only after her passing that her children found a small notebook tucked in her nightstand drawer, filled with careful calculations dating back decades, tracking exactly how many years her savings would need to last based on her own mother's lifespan. She had been quietly doing this math her entire adult life, long before anyone in the family ever realized it, and every small, frugal habit her children gently teased her about had been, in her own mind, a genuine act of responsible provision for herself, so that she would never need to ask anyone for help. The 12th and final thing is a quiet, sometimes barely acknowledged envy of younger people's energy, opportunities, and years still ahead of them, occasionally surfacing as sharp comments about a grandchild's freedom or a younger colleague's career that seem to come from nowhere. This can be uncomfortable for families to witness, especially when it emerges toward people the older adult clearly loves. But I want you to understand this as something profoundly human, rather than something ugly or petty. Watching decades of possibility narrow down to a smaller and smaller set of remaining years is genuinely difficult, even for the most gracious and grateful among us, and an occasional flash of envy toward those with more time still ahead of them is not a moral failing. It is grief, appearing sideways, for a version of life that has quietly passed by. A close friend once told me about her father, normally the gentlest man imaginable, snapping unexpectedly at her when she mentioned an upcoming trip to Europe with friends, a trip he himself had always dreamed of taking, but never quite managed before his health made travel difficult. He apologized within the hour, clearly embarrassed by his own reaction, and admitted quietly that watching her make plans for a future that felt increasingly distant to him had simply caught him off guard in a moment he was not prepared for. That single honest conversation, rather than lingering resentment on either side, became one of the closest moments they shared that entire year, precisely because she chose curiosity over defensiveness in response to his outburst. I have shared these 12 things with you today not to catalog complaints about the people we love as they age, and certainly not to shame anyone watching who recognizes themselves in this list. I have shared them because I believe understanding is the beginning of compassion, both for the parents and grandparents in our lives navigating these changes, and for ourselves, as we notice these same patterns quietly beginning in our own lives as the years accumulate. None of these 12 things are truly ugly, whatever unkind label they sometimes get assigned by a frustrated family member at the end of a long day. They are, almost without exception, deeply human responses to genuinely difficult circumstances: fear of losing control, grief over a changing body, loneliness that has crept in slowly, and an entirely reasonable desire to be seen, valued, and heard, even as the world sometimes seems increasingly eager to look past those who have lived the longest among us. If you recognized someone you love in several of these descriptions today, I hope you will approach them this week with a little more patience and a little more curiosity about what might be sitting underneath the behavior that has frustrated you. And if you recognized yourself in several of these descriptions instead, I hope you will extend yourself that same patience and know that none of this makes you difficult or ugly or any less worthy of love. It simply makes you human, walking honestly through a season of life that asks more of us than almost any other. There is a particular kind of relief, I have noticed, that comes over a room when someone finally says one of these things out loud, plainly and without shame, rather than letting it sit quietly as an unspoken family tension. A daughter admitting she understands now why her mother repeats the same stories. A son finally asking his father directly why he refuses every offer of help, rather than simply growing resentful in silence. These conversations rarely happen on their own. They require someone willing to go first, to name the pattern gently rather than complain about it privately, and to ask, with real curiosity, what might be underneath it. I hope today's conversation gives you the words to be that person in your own family, whichever side of these 12 things you happen to find yourself on. Thank you for spending this time with me today. If this gave you a new way of understanding someone you love, or perhaps yourself, I hope you will stay with us here at Golden Wisdom, and I will see you in the next one.